All right. Live stream successful.
Live streaming.
We'll give it a minute or so for some people to join in.
Yep.
Sure.
Okay. Looking good.
All righty. There's some people starting to join. I'm sure, yeah, we're up to 26.
You see that on your end?
Yeah, it's we can see that there. So, all right. So,
everybody.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in tonight. Another awesome guest tonight, James Evans, who's the Director of Natural Resources for the City of Sanibel. And Chris and I met James, was probably early 2016, right around the time we started Captains for Clean Water. We started showing up at all these government meetings and, public meetings on water quality, and James was at every one of them. And our communications with a lot of our local elected officials, everybody said, hey, you need to talk to James about this. So we had a couple calls and a couple meetings, and realized that, you're probably one of the best resources around here in Southwest Florida that's working on these issues every day. See you at pretty much every South Florida Water Management District Governing Board meeting. And I think the amount of time you spend on this issue is probably more than most in the state of Florida that are working on natural resources. I mean, it's Lake Okeechobee and water quality is number one thing for Sanibel. So that's essentially your job there, right? Is looking out for the natural resources, which kind of are the driver to our economy.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me to join you guys tonight. I've always enjoyed working with you guys. As a resource-based group, the captains have been instrumental in getting, attention to our water resource issues. And I appreciate what you guys do. But yeah, I've been the Director of Natural Resources for the City of Sanibel since 2012. Prior to that, I worked for the City of Sanibel. I've been working for the City of Sanibel for about 20 years now. My anniversary was in January. And prior to that, I started my career doing research on the Caloosahatchee, looking at oyster reefs, seagrasses, and water quality in the Caloosahatchee, and working to develop indicators as part of the South Florida Water Management District's valued ecosystem component study. So that was led by Peter Doreen and his team at the Water Management District before he retired, and we helped collect that data for them to help shape what those indicators were telling us in the Caloosahatchee, and how we could use those to kind of gauge what the Caloosahatchee needed for freshwater flows, but also to use it as a tool to gauge the success of Everglades restoration. So yeah, I started my career, back in, about 1998, 1999, and been working on those issues since then. And yes, the water resource issues are absolutely critical to the economy of Sanibel and Southwest Florida. We have about a $3 billion tourism industry here in Lee County. And without the protection of our waters, our coastal bays and estuaries, our beaches, and our natural environments here on Sanibel, we wouldn't have the economy that we have today. So.
Yeah, and looking at it, I grew up not on Sanibel, but my grandmother lived there and spent a lot of time there, and it was just such a different experience when you cross the bridge and get over there to Sanibel. And I think that's the one of many things that Sanibel's done really well is recognizing, decades ago that those natural resources were really a key driver for the tourism industry and the real estate market on Sanibel. And it's a lot more unique place than really anywhere we have on the west coast of Florida.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, if it weren't for, our founding fathers here on Sanibel, including, Porter Goss and many of the other leaders. He was the first mayor of Sanibel. They really, came up with a comprehensive land use plan called the Sanibel Plan that really put wildlife and wildlife habitat at the top of the community's hierarchy of values. And that is really important because instead of focusing on other sectors, we've really put that wildlife and wildlife habitat, at the top of our values, and we've developed around those principles, which has allowed us to protect more than 2/3 of the entire island for conservation purposes, which in turn has helped us protect our water quality. We have some issues with our water quality here on Sanibel, but we're working on those issues. But by preserving that land, it won't be developed in the future. And of course, for the citizens of Sanibel, I think less is more. And we've seen that as we've weathered some of the storms with the recessions, and hopefully as we weather the storm of this current pandemic, hopefully we'll rebound and have just as vibrant of a small business community supported by our natural resources. So I think it's critical, and I think it's served us well.
Yeah, and I know a lot of my charter clients.
That's a good point, James. And I think Sanibel can be a model to how things can be managed. As grew up out there, went to elementary school at Sanibel Elementary, and largely the island, hasn't changed since I lived out there. Pine trees lining periwinkle after Hurricane Charlie, but development wise, it's very much it was when that Sanibel can set a good example to how we can still be prosperous and develop areas, but do it responsibly and have as low impact as we can in the environment.
Right, Chris, you bring up a good point, and I think it's important to just give a shout out to our mayor and Sanibel City Council. They have worked really hard to walk the walk, because we certainly talk the talk. We want to see improvements in the Caloosahatchee. We want to see Lake Okeechobee managed in a way that protects our coastal estuaries and our coastal communities. But we're also doing everything that we can in our own backyards to improve water quality. We've developed a comprehensive nutrient management plan that really kind of lays out a strategy to address the water quality issues in our own backyard. We're trying to implement a number of projects, including about $20 million in upgrades to our wastewater treatment plant on Sanibel, the Donex water reclamation facility. And that's going to reduce the nitrogen and phosphorus in our reuse water by 50 to 70%. So, we're making those investments. Our citizens fully support the water quality initiatives that we've implemented. And without the citizens' support, we wouldn't be doing these things that we do, both here locally, but also regionally to address the issues in Lake Okeechobee and the Caloosahatchee.
Yeah, and that's I think that's probably one of the topics that a lot of our viewers tonight are going to be interested in. Is City of Sanibel has been at the very tip of the spear, fighting for water quality at the bigger picture. What comes down the Caloosahatchee, the water that we need during the dry season from the Caloosahatchee and the lake. And we know all my charter clients, 95% of them would pay the premium to stay on Sanibel because they cared about those resources. So it's something where we see the economic thing. We see that there's value to people to keep places like Sanibel, so that they can live there, they can come visit. But a lot of the stuff you do is outside of Sanibel as well. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to argue that Sanibel has done an incredible job of, walking the walk, as far as, everything from, plastic straws to water quality to, conservation land out there. But there's a lot more to this fight than what we can do in our own backyards, because we get, as we saw 2 years ago, in June of 2018, when Lake Okeechobee's levels rise too high, we get discharges, and y'all are right at the end of the barrel there to get that. So that's I think something that's really unique. The city of Sanibel has taken that fight really to the next level, and with you and members of council being so active in this.
Right, and we haven't done it alone. Of course, what makes us so powerful, I think, is the partnerships that we have with the Captains for Clean Water, with the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, the Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. Many of our partners, the Southwest Florida, or the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, many of our West Coast stakeholders and partners work very closely together. We monitor the conditions using the real-time data that is provided by the SCCF recon monitoring stations. Without that data, we wouldn't know what's going on from minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day. So I think that information is critical, and we've really been able to develop some really important tools so that we can provide, weekly conditions reports to the Army Corps of Engineers and the South Florida Water Management District, our state and federal partners. I think that's really helped move the ball and helped us monitor conditions much more closely in the Caloosahatchee specifically. But of course, that's also allowed us to use that data. What we pride ourselves here on Sanibel is that, we make all of our decisions based on the best available science. Try not to do it based on emotion. We really ground ourselves in the science. And I think that has really served us well because it adds that credibility that we have, and the data and the value of that data and the quality of that data, so that policymakers, can make decisions. And I think it is really, paid dividends. I think that, Governor DeSantis, when he came into office, when he, came through the doors and immediately adopted Executive Order 19-12, you could see those partnerships really paid off. I think that all of that information and the data and the economic impacts, all of that was used to help make the case of why we need to do something different than what we've done in the past.
Yeah, for sure. And that's it also, City of Sanibel, the work SCCF does. I mean, I was using the recon thing as a fishing guide pretty much every day. I would check, a lot of the different stations, but the fact that science is there, and that it's kind of a foundation that citizens and interest groups, public interest groups can come in and build upon that. That's always, you have to have that foundation to be able to advocate for anything. And what SCCF and City of Sanibel do and providing all that data publicly, it makes it a lot easier for groups like ours, and same with Orca and Florida Oceanographic over on the East Coast, having that baseline of data to where it's like, we don't have to spend our time, messing around with all that stuff, because there's scientists and professionals that are doing that day in, day out, so we can quickly access whatever data we need, and it often tells a very similar story to what we're observing day in, day out there on the water.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you bring up another point. It's not just the West Coast stakeholder partnerships that we have, but it's also the partnerships we have with the East Coast, with the folks in the Everglades, the folks in Florida Bay. It's all of those partnerships, those folks in Lake Okeechobee that care about the resource, the fishing guides, the fishermen, and all the people that care about these resources. It's all of us working together to balance the system so that it provides a good quality of life for everybody, whether you're in Glades or Hendry County in the rural areas, or you're in the coastal communities in the more developed areas. I think it's all of us working together to make sure that we, are trying to balance those purposes to the best of our ability. Sometimes we get the short end of the stick, but I see some changes, and I think that it's just important to let the science drive the decisions, not the politics.
Yeah, absolutely. That's if the science was driving all the decisions that were made in water quality in Florida, this problem, we wouldn't need to be sitting here having this conversation, because it would have been fixed a long time ago. That's I think it's kind of pretty obvious, when you look at this, what needs to happen. It's and bringing science into it and letting that drive the direction of all of our collective advocacy. That's what's ultimately going to get us to the place we need to be. So Let's
Yep.
talk about the Caloosahatchee River, because I think you do an excellent job of explaining it. And, you have the background of so much research in the Caloosahatchee. Let's talk about the water needs or lack thereof of the Caloosahatchee. I think a lot of people are very focused on one area. Not that many people see the big picture and understand what the upper estuary used to look like and what the lower estuary used to look like, and how that balance is important. We do need water during the dry season, and we don't want too much water during the wet season. Can you explain how that balance works and why it's important to maintain that?
Right. So, we have what's called the Caloosahatchee conundrum. We need water during the dry season. But during the wet season, we don't want too much water. So it's kind of like the Goldilocks principle that Rayanne Wessel, the past policy director, natural resource policy director from SCCF, coined the term. And it really is the Goldilocks principle. We want it just right. But unfortunately, the way the system, has been designed, it tends to be feast or famine. We get way too much water during the wet season and not enough water during the dry season. And so the reason for that is we have to go back to when the system, was modified more than 100 years ago. When Hamilton Diston dredged a channel from Lake Okeechobee through the marsh, connecting all of the upper chain of lakes within the Caloosahatchee and dredging a straight channel out to the Gulf of Mexico. What that did was essentially permanently changed the hydrology of the Caloosahatchee. It changed the timing at which the flows moved to the estuary and out into the Gulf of Mexico. It changed the quality of that water by making the system very flashy, where when we get rainfall, it falls on the landscape, it runs off the landscape and quickly into a channelized canal out into the Gulf of Mexico. And the quantity of water we get usually isn't enough during the dry season, but is way too much during the wet season. And the distribution of those flows, usually, aren't when we need them. So it's that whole quality, quantity, timing, and distribution that we need to restore to be able to get the flows that we need at the right time and quality within the Caloosahatchee. So, of course, with the Caloosahatchee, a lot of people tend to think that all of our problems originate in Lake Okeechobee, and that's just not a fact. We get on average, about 50% of our flows from Lake Okeechobee and about 50% from the watershed. The watershed makes up about 865,000 acres of land. And when you look at the Caloosahatchee, the Lake Okeechobee, it's about 730 square miles. So, I have to run those numbers, but it's significantly larger than the actual watershed of Lake Okeechobee. And so, the runoff in the Caloosahatchee during certain periods of time can absolutely dwarf the flows that come from Lake Okeechobee. And of course, when the river was straightened, the Army Corps of Engineers installed 3 lock structures, one at Moorhaven, which is the S77 structure, one at Ortona, which is the S78 structure, and one at S79, which is the Franklin Lock and Dam structure. And what those do is, they hold water at different levels within the Caloosahatchee to allow travel of boats through the system, through the intercoastal waterway. But it also affects the flows to the estuary. And it actually, the S79 structure separates the estuary from the freshwater portion of the Caloosahatchee. And that's why it's critical that we get those appropriate freshwater flows either from the watershed or from Lake Okeechobee as supplemental flows during the dry season, so that we can maintain the appropriate salinity gradient from San Carlos Bay all the way up to the freshwater portion of the estuary. And that's critical because many of the species that are economically important finfish, like the tarpon and snook and redfish and everything, rely on a prey base like anchovies and things that actually reproduce within the Caloosahatchee estuary. And if you don't have what we call the low salinity zone, that's the zone of salinity somewhere between 0.5 practical salinity units and about 5 or 6. then you don't have, the nursery for many of those prey, the prey-based fishes that feed many of our economically important sport fish that you all catch when you're out with your clients. So, I think it's critical that we get those flows during the dry season, but that we also have enough storage within the system that will allow us to reduce or at least take the peaks off of those high flow discharges from Lake Okeechobee. Now, that doesn't address fully the issues we have within the watershed, given that we have, a watershed of about 865,000 acres. But with additional storage, agricultural best management practices, those can go a long ways to reducing those flows within the watershed. So, it's a number of things we're going to have to do. It's that storage north, east, south, west of Lake Okeechobee. It's restoring that, that flow corridor south into the central Everglades and out into Florida Bay where that water is needed during the dry season and the wet season when we're getting too much. And also to make sure that we have that storage needed to provide those freshwater flows to the Caloosahatchee during the dry season.
Yeah, that's a great summary.
That's a good.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, good. We have a lot of the water that comes out of the Caloosahatchee is from the local basin, and that, a lot of times that we can handle, or the river can handle water. And that water and Lake Okeechobee discharges on top of it for really long durations. When we're getting, high volume, harmful discharge levels for, months on end, is when we see like the habitat damage as far as grass and oysters and stuff like that. And like you said, if we take peaks, we always say is Everglades restoration for the coast and for the water management levels in Lake Okeechobee is it brings the valleys up and brings the peaks down. So it's such a fast thing. And that's, that's that balance we're talking about, trying to get closer to a balance level. And more importantly, or every bit as importantly, is getting the water that comes us Florida Everglades where it's really, really needed.
Yeah, and so you make a good point. The discharges from Lake Okeechobee really compound the impacts or effects of the freshwater discharges from the watershed. But I would argue that the flows we get from the watershed alone are in the harmful range. So to put that in perspective, let me just talk a little bit about the flow targets or the salinity targets that have been put forward for the Caloosahatchee. So previously, we used to think that somewhere between 450 cubic feet per second and 2,800 cubic feet per second were kind of good targets that would be good restoration targets for the Caloosahatchee. But because of all the science we've collected over the years and all of the great data that's been provided, the scientists at the Water Management District and the other scientists here locally, have kind of gone back to the drawing board to look at what those targets might be. And the Army Corps of Engineers and the South Florida Water Management District just recently published the water quality performance measures for Recover, which is Recover is a program within the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan that's used to assess how restoration is performing as we move forward with some of these restoration projects. And what they found was that for the Caloosahatchee, our optimal flows are between 2,100 and 750 cubic feet per second and about 2,100 cubic feet per second. When we get above 2,100 to about 2,600 cubic feet per second, we see stressful conditions within the Caloosahatchee from the high flows. And when we get above 2,600 cubic feet per second, we actually see harmful impacts to the lower estuary, the bay, and out into the Gulf of Mexico at varying flow rates. Below 750 cubic feet per second, we actually see stress within the system, and below the minimum flow and level, which was established for the Caloosahatchee, which was 457 cubic feet per second, we actually start to see see harm. And at a certain point, you can actually see significant harm. And we've seen that in the Caloosahatchee. In fact, because of the way the water was managed in the Caloosahatchee, going back to the 1990, 2000, 2001 time period, we lost over 1,000 acres of tape grass. It's a freshwater grass in the upper estuary that used to be a tremendous nursery for a lot of our finfish and shellfish in the upper estuary, but that has been mostly wiped out because of poor water management practices. And we've never been able to recover that because for a number of reasons. For one, a lot of the grass is getting grazed down by a number of the organisms within the estuary, but it's also because we haven't been able to reestablish, the appropriate flows for a long enough period before we, cut off the Caloosahatchee from flows from the lake, or, we don't get enough from the watershed and we wipe out the grasses again. So I would argue that because of the way the system's been ditched and drained, the lack of holding water on the landscape, because of the way the system's been ditched and drained in the Caloosahatchee watershed, in that 865,000 acre watershed, even without the Lake Okeechobee flows, we still see damaging flows to the Caloosahatchee. Right now, we're receiving weekly average flows from the Caloosahatchee watershed with zero flows from Lake Okeechobee, averaging over 2,800 cubic feet per second, which is in that harm threshold.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, that tape grass, even when I was a kid, it was in a lot better shape than it is. It's been in recent years, but I didn't see it. I was born in '91. I didn't see it back in the peak. When it was in the '80s, when it was very healthy. But that, during my lifetime, I've seen a significant decline in the fishery up there in the upper estuary. The Orange River, my family's got some property up there. All through that area, by the old railroad trestles, that used to be some incredible fishing up there. There's still good fishing up there, but the habitat there's just nowhere near. I mean, you go up there, even 15, 20 years ago, and there were mullet all over the place. Now it's rare to see a mullet, jump in the Orange River or anywhere around there. They're there, but I remember sitting at my family's house up there, and you'd look out at dinner, and there'd be hundreds of mullet jumping, and you just don't see that diversity up in the upper estuary. And those species that live up there, our snook, a lot of our snook go up there every single year to feed, and then they come all the way down to the passes and the beaches of Sanibel to spawn. And when you start taking out parts of critical habitat for species, even though you might only fish for them in Pine Island Sound, that's still negatively impacting the snook population overall.
Absolutely. And so we look at tape grass as really, it's a habitat. It's not a single species, it's a habitat. And I think if you could bring up slide number 4 and then slide number 5, I think your viewers will kind of get an idea of what the extent of that tape grass habitat actually looked like. Because a lot of people, don't remember that tape grass habitat. These are photos that were provided by the Coosa Riverkeeper, John Cassani, in the 80s. Let's see here, 1979 to 1984. That's what the tape grass in the upper estuary looked like from approximately 41 bridges down to Cape Coral, and it was an extensive habitat. You can see, the rafts of tape grass that would have provided that incredible habitat for the fishery, but also provided that baffling effect and the benefits to water quality that I would argue have had an impact on the quality of our water in the estuary and our coastal waters as well. So if you want to go to that next slide, it kind of is a blow up, which is slide 5. Yeah, and you can see the extensive tape grass habitat there, just so your viewers can kind of get a real perspective of what it used to look like in the Caloosahatchee, instead of just talking about 1,000 acres of something that was lost. Now you can kind of visualize what that looks like. But what you can't visualize is all the activity that's going on below the surface there. It's like a coral reef. That structure, it provides that habitat for those fish to hide and the predators to move around, and it's just a tremendous habitat. All right, you can come back. Thanks.
Yeah, that was
Yeah,
a really
those
powerful
pictures are-
visual for sure.
Yeah, I mean that's when I was at, and in addition to the habitat, just what that amount of grass does to filter the water and to catch sediment as water flows down the river for what he, you know, we would even, you know, back when we had all that grass, even when we did have a lot of rain and you'd get that brown tannin water, it is still relatively clear as being able to see through it. Once you lose that grass, then, you know, you start to get all that sediment and those big sediment plumes that, you know, go all the way out past, and they're compounding butterfly effect from that, as far as it covering over or blocking out light for other grasses downstream and oysters and stuff like that. So it's so many components. When you remove one link out of that chain, the effect that it has downstream is pretty drastic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize how much stuff is in the seagrass. You know, we know it from throwing a cast net. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff in there that you want in your live oil for bait, and a bunch more that you don't. But when you go out there and, you know, when you get some of that grass in your hands, I mean, there's baby seahorses, and if you look at a single blade of seagrass, there's, you know, all kinds of different organisms, you know, on each one. So I mean, when you start to see, you know, acres and acres and acres of that grass, whether it's here or Florida Bay or, you know, lower estuary, upper estuary, when that starts to die, there's an incredible amount of life that's, you know, it's out of sight, out of mind for a lot of people. But, you know, I don't care if you like fishing or picking up shells on the beach or looking at dolphins or looking at manatees, you know, whatever living things that you enjoy about our ecosystem here, our environment here, they're all dependent on that in one way or another. It's once you start taking away the foundation of the estuary. I mean, it's kind of like what we saw with coronavirus at the grocery store. There's just less options there. You go there and you kind of like, well, this is what we're having for dinner. Like, they're out of chicken, so we're doing this. It's you know, you don't see it because you know, you're not out there. You know, none of us are out there 24/7, but I mean, all that stuff are apex predators, whether, you know, like the tarpon here on the wall that I want to go out there and catch, or the dolphins, or whatever it is. They're all, the number of them are determined by how much habitat there is and how much, you know, forage can grow up in that. So seagrass is super important. And, you know, I think we still need to do a lot more education on that so people can really see, you know, and, you know, I've seen studies that show that an acre of seagrass can sequester as much carbon as an acre of Amazon rainforest. For, you know, for our climate, that's super important. And, you know, our water management practices here in the state of Florida are essentially determining what our seagrass habitats are going to look like throughout the state.
Absolutely, and I will applaud the South Florida Water Management District. This year, or last year, they, you know, adopted a new rule for the Caloosahatchee to update the minimum flow and level. Previously, it was 300 cubic feet per second. Today, it's 457 cubic feet per second. While that's not a restoration target, it's certainly a step in the right direction, much closer to, you know, to a number that's more protective of the estuary rather than what we had before. I also applaud the Water Management District and the governor for moving forward very quickly with the C43 reservoir project and the C43 reservoir water quality treatment component. I happen to be a member of the working group that are working to help vet a number of different technologies that will be used to treat the water as it either comes into the reservoir, within the reservoir, or as it leaves the reservoir. And there's a number of you know, our partners at Lee County, you know, Cape Coral, Hendry County. All of us are working together to come up with, you know, a plan that we can implement at some future date, so that we can treat the water that's coming into the reservoir. We understand the reservoir is going to provide all the flows we need to restore the Caloosahatchee, and until additional storage comes online within the Caloosahatchee watershed, we're going to rely on Lake Okeechobee. So, I know, people don't maybe understand this as well, but we're not like the St. Lucie. The St. Lucie doesn't want any water from Lake Okeechobee, and I completely understand that. But the Caloosahatchee is going to be dependent on some amount of flow from Lake Okeechobee to make sure that we can balance those salinities within the estuary. Regardless of the nutrients that come in with that water, we still have to balance the salinity. We would like to reduce those nutrients that come from Lake Okeechobee by treating it north of Lake Okeechobee, or the water that moves south into the Everglades, making sure that water is treated by the stormwater treatment areas and goes into the water conservation areas clean. But also the water, once it's in Lake Okeechobee, we hope that water at some point, will be cleaner than it is today, because it's nowhere close to meeting water quality standards. But I think it's really critical that we also do a better job in our own watershed. While we talk a lot about what happens north of the lake and south of the lake within the Everglades agricultural area, there is a lot that needs to be done within the Caloosahatchee watershed to slow those flows down, and remove the nutrients within the watershed, so that the water we get from the watershed is also cleaner, and that we can handle the water that comes from the watershed, so that it doesn't cause problems without those flows from Lake Okeechobee. So, it's a big puzzle that we're all working on, and it's going to take time. It took a long time to break the system, and it's going to take a long time to restore the system. But I think we're moving in the right direction, but it's going to take the political will, to get over the goal line.
Yeah, for sure. So with our watershed, the Caloosahatchee watershed, it starts, present day, pretty much right at the S77 locks, which is Moorhaven locks, where the Caloosahatchee is connected to Lake Okeechobee, and it goes down to, through Cape Coral and part of Fort Myers. So where in the watershed, what are the different issues and how do we fix them?
Yeah, so maybe it'd be helpful if you bring up slide number 1. It's a watershed map that kind of shows the different components of our Caloosahatchee Basin, or the watershed. And I'm going to use those terms synonymously or interchangeably. Basin, watershed, that's how we refer to the watershed. So as you're bringing that up, so the Caloosahatchee watershed, again, it makes up about 865,000 acres. The eastern Caloosahatchee watershed extends from Lake Okeechobee at the Moorhaven lock at the S77 structure, and extends to the S78 structure in Ortona. The western Caloosahatchee subbasin, which is between the eastern Caloosahatchee subbasin and the tidal Caloosahatchee subbasin, that is the area, the central portion of the Caloosahatchee, and that essentially runs from the S78 lock and dam structure to the Franklin lock and dam structure at S79. And that includes, Hendry County, parts of Glades County. And it's really, an area, those areas of the watershed, the eastern Caloosahatchee and the western Caloosahatchee, the land use in those areas are predominantly agricultural lands. And obviously back in the 1880s, when the Caloosahatchee was ditched and drained and channelized, the goal of those land use changes are really so that we could develop those areas for agriculture and
Hey, hold on, James, 1 second. Let's which slide did you want up there? I want to make sure we get this up.
Yeah, slide number 1.
Slide number 1.
Yes.
All right, we'll get this up here. That way it'll be a little bit more reference.
Yeah, sorry. All right. So yeah, let me go back and just point out the areas. So we have the eastern Caloosahatchee, which runs from the lake to the Ortona structure. We've got the western Caloosahatchee that runs from the S78 structure to the S79 structure around Alva. And we've got the tidal Caloosahatchee, which is the area that's influenced by the tidal inflow from the estuary. And that's what we refer to as the Caloosahatchee estuary. That's the area that that has a salinity gradient. That's the area that we're really trying to protect, for a number of the critters that live within the estuary. Of course, we want to protect the entire freshwater system as well. But when we talk about the estuary, that's the area that we're talking about. And so most of the development you'll see really takes place within the tidal portion of the estuary. And I think it's probably, it would be probably good if you bring up slide number 9, because Then we can talk about the watershed and some of the nutrient issues that are present in some of the different areas of the watershed. So that's slide number 9, if you wouldn't mind bringing that up real quick. Okay, thank you. So if you look at the pie chart on the left, you can see that, that upper left-hand pie chart shows you the phosphorus load contribution to the Caloosahatchee from the tidal basin, Lake Okeechobee, and the C43 and the S4 basin. The S4 basin is a small little sub-basin within the Caloosahatchee watershed that's primarily agriculture. It's just to the west of Lake Okeechobee, and is an area that we actually have pretty high concentrations of nutrients because of the intensity of the agricultural land use in that area. But you can see that about 58% of the phosphorus actually comes from the C43 and S4 basins. The tidal basin only provides about 12%, while Lake Okeechobee provides about 30% on average. When you're looking at, the period of record here from this slide, this is a graphic that was provided by the South Florida Water Management District, includes water years 2014 through water years 2018. And you can see again, about 30% on average of the phosphorus came from Lake Okeechobee. The overwhelming majority came from the watershed. But when we look at nitrogen, it's a slightly different picture. About 40% of that nitrogen comes from Lake Okeechobee. About 46% of the nitrogen comes from the C43 and S4 basins, and about 14% of the nitrogen comes from the tidal basin. So, while the tidal basin is the most developed portion of the entire Caloosahatchee watershed, the majority of the nutrients are actually coming from east of the Franklin Lock and Dam. So those are areas, while we definitely need to work on, reducing development and addressing the, stormwater runoff within the tidal basin, we also need to focus on reducing the runoff within the agricultural areas east of S79, and also trying to address the nutrients that are discharged from Lake Okeechobee.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even if we fixed 100% of the nutrient input from the tidal basin or Cape area, we're only talking about a 14% reduction, where the lion's share of the nutrients making it into the water are from, those more east basins.
Yeah, and let me turn on the light here. The sun's going down. So nitrogen and phosphorus. This was something that I learned 4.5 years ago, when I kind of got involved with this. I mean, I knew, the NPK with fertilizer you get for, your garden or your lawn. But I didn't really understand kind of how all those different nutrients impacted the waterways. And if you look at the Everglades, phosphorus is a big killer there, because it's causing cattails to grow. It causes all kinds of harm to water flow and the native vegetation in the glades. But when you look at a saltwater environment, the nitrogen is, we're in a nitrogen limited system. So can you explain, how those nutrients affect algae blooms when you get down further into the estuary, like the lower estuary? If we have an algae bloom there, how is that going to impact it?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So in general, nitrogen and phosphorus are critical for life, period. And just like any plant, algae can take up nutrients in the water to grow. The nitrogen and phosphorus are used for plant growth. And in freshwater systems, typically, phosphorus is the limiting nutrient, meaning that you have an overabundance of nitrogen, but when you add, even a small amount of phosphorus, it can actually spur the growth of algae in freshwater systems. Where in the estuary, or in that transition point to the estuary, you can actually have what's called co-limiting, where both nitrogen and phosphorus can limit the growth of algae. But in the estuary or into the coastal waters and marine environments, typically, and not always, but typically, nitrogen is the limiting nutrient. That you have an overabundance of phosphorus, especially in our area where we have rich phosphorus deposits within the Bone Valley and within the coastal system. Nitrogen tends to be the limiting nutrient, and so when you have too much nitrogen, you'll get an overabundance of algae. And that's not just, the algae you saw in the pictures in the canals in Cape Coral in 2018, like, the microcystis, which are toxin producing, or, the red tide, the dinoflagellate red tide, Carenia brevis that you see out in the marine environment in the Gulf of Mexico. That's also the drift algae and large macroalgae that can, cover and smother the seagrass beds that we all depend on for our fisheries. So, what we want to do is make sure that we have the appropriate balance of nutrients within the system. You don't want to, have too much nitrogen or too much phosphorus, because then that can get out of the appropriate ratios and you can have other problems. So the idea is that we have the appropriate ratios. And that's really what the Florida Department of Environmental Protection's total maximum daily load program is set up to do. It's really to limit, those human or anthropogenic sources of nutrients, while understanding that nutrients are important in the natural system for natural function of the ecosystem. But it's that overabundance of nutrients that humans provide to the system that we need to address.
Yeah, and that's definitely helps put things in perspective. But I think a lot of people struggle to understand that still. The red drift algae is a good example. Fishermen hate it when it gets really bad. It fouls our nets, fouls our lines, makes it really hard to go out there and fish. But it's all eating the same stuff, and those nutrients, it takes a very long time for them to go anywhere. Once we have a big nutrient influx in the bay, those nutrients can be taken up by Carenia brevis, red tide, can be taken up by the red drift algae, other forms of macroalgae, and they live through a life cycle. They die. Those nutrients are released back in the water. So it's that nutrient loading is not something that it's not like we have discharges, it's a problem, and then the water cleans up and it's gone. It takes a while for those to really cycle out, and we see it. Especially when I was out on the water every day, you would see it as soon as all that red drift algae starts to die. We would often see other algae blooms that would fire up. It wouldn't get quite as bad, and it would be a cycle. And it would take a long time for those nutrients to really leave the estuary. And we're often in a situation where we have another big nutrient load before the last one was gone. But yeah, it's they're seemingly harmless nutrients, but when they're elevated in the estuary, it can cause pretty serious changes. And some of them are when it's red tide, when it's blue-green algae, everybody in Southwest Florida is very aware of it. But when those other macroalgae blooms are out there, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. But the problem's still there. Those nutrients are still there.
Yeah, and of course the nutrients, the biological responses to these nutrients can manifest themselves in very different ways. For example, in 2005, 2006, into 2007, after some really high discharges from Lake Okeechobee that occurred for quite a long time, very high volume discharges, some of the highest I remember in my career, we saw drift algae washing up and stacking up on Sanibel's beaches that was 2 and 3 feet thick. And that happened for months on end. That had a tremendous impact on Sanibel's economy. We had people checking out of the hotels. Small businesses were struggling. We saw an impact on property values. And then, of course, in 2018, we saw the blue-green algae blooms impacting the canals. The entire main stem of the Caloosahatchee, but also, the canals in North Fort Myers, as well as the whole, the Cape Coral canals along the Caloosahatchee. And those blue-green algae blooms were pushed out into San Carlos Bay and onto Sanibel. And then, of course, as those blooms break down, those nutrients don't just disappear. They change forms. And so as those nutrients are processed by algae, they can be broken down into more, either less or more biologically available forms. But in the case of red tide, I think that the work that USGS and some of the other folks have done, I think there's pretty good evidence that suggests as blue-green algae and other algae break down, Carenia brevis, red tide, is not a picky eater. It will eat any nutrient that's available. So the nitrogen and phosphorus, as they break down or released from the cells of microcystis, the blue-green algae, the cyanobacteria, they can be consumed and taken up by red tide. So, in 2018, we were extremely concerned when we saw those blue-green algae blooms upstream. And that was prior to the, major red tide blooms that followed those events. And, again, we just need to reduce the nutrients altogether, the nitrogen and phosphorus. We don't need to kind of pick and choose. We really have an overabundance of nitrogen and phosphorus in the system that needs to be addressed. But, when we have these high flow discharges from Lake Okeechobee or very high volume discharges from the watershed, we're going to see a biological response. We just don't know whether it's going to be red tide, cyanobacteria, red tide, or some other harmful algal bloom that we don't know about yet.
Yeah, that's
Yep.
that's definitely the a really good way of explaining it. And it's one of the reasons why we're having these happy hours. I hope people are tuning in and listening to that. It's really important that Floridians and visitors to Florida understand how that works. It's we often people want things oversimplified, and their questions are like, well, what causes what? And it's like, well, there's a lot of unknowns in science, and the biggest known is that if we're putting a bunch of nutrients into a system, it's going to have effects. And we can't say that this causes that as far as this water from Lake Okeechobee or this water from here or there. But the big picture, if we can significantly reduce our nutrients, we're going to have less algae blooms.
Absolutely.
And there's other factors to it, and heat and stuff that they're a little bigger problems to tackle. But the nutrients are something that if we cut that back, it's less food for harmful algae blooms or other algae blooms.
Yeah, and Daniel, the one thing we haven't talked about much is our connection and reliance on Lake Okeechobee for a number of reasons. A healthy lake ecosystem that's beneficial to the fishermen, beneficial to the ecology of Lake Okeechobee is good for the estuaries. Good water quality in Lake Okeechobee benefits us. Being able to have a robust and vibrant littoral zone and marsh within the lake benefits us. Being able to maintain lake levels at the appropriate levels, as kind of outlined in some of the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan recover targets, which would put the lake somewhere between 12 and a half, or about maintaining the lake about 12 to 15 feet. That is beneficial to the Caloosahatchee. The challenge is, when the lake levels get high, nobody wants that water, so it's discharged east and west. We get the lion's share of that water in the Caloosahatchee. I think it's like 46% of that water from the lake comes to the Caloosahatchee. The remainder goes south or into the St. Lucie. So, we get the lion's share of those high flow impacts. But if we were to hold the lake higher and maintain it higher for longer, we have a larger volume of water that we're dealing with. And if it can't be moved south into the Everglades because we don't have the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir, the EA reservoir, or that water can't be treated to a high enough standard to be able to move that into Everglades National Park, we're going to get more of that water. So I think it's critical that we, work closely with our partners in Lake Okeechobee and in the East Coast to make sure that, that we maintain Lake Okeechobee as a lake, not as a reservoir.
Yeah, and that's something that I used to duck hunt on the lake. Chris used to duck hunt a lot out there as well. And we saw what happens when the lake gets really low. We saw what happens when that lake gets really high. And to me, when that lake gets high, there's nothing worse for it out there, because it kills everything. Once that water gets up there, all that vegetation starts rotting. And we've seen that happen a lot, and immediately our water quality that we do get discharged from the lake to the Caloosahatchee goes down, because you have rotting vegetation, you have sediment that gets stirred up easier when there's wind events, and we've got we have to maintain the health of that lake and have vibrant marshes out there in the lake, because if we don't, if you look at the data of nutrient loading coming, per gallon of water, the amount of nutrients coming to the Caloosahatchee versus the St. Lucie, our water quality is better because there's a huge marsh on the west side of the lake that the St. Lucie does not have. our freshwater wetlands are super critical to the health of our saltwater estuaries and their ability to sequester nutrients and hold down sediments. So, it slows the system down. It's like a natural filter as they function for thousands of years.
Yes, and obviously that's why it's
People
concerning.
Understand.
Oh, God.
Sorry, I got a delay on mine, but I think it's important for people to understand that we have, two issues, and one is the salinity balance or caused volume, and the other is the nutrient load issue, and they're both big problems, and they're both solved kind of differently, and they both have different impact. A lot of people confuse them or try to tie them together, and I think that's that's something that people need to understand, is that you're talking about two different problems that are connected, not the same.
Right. So that's a really good point. So nutrient loading to the estuary or to any water body is a function of the concentration of nutrients in the water, which is the quality, obviously, and the flow. So you get the load by multiplying the concentration times the flow. So as you reduce the volume of water, you're also reducing the nutrient load, which has a benefit. But if you're not getting the right volume of water to balance salinity and some of the other parameters within the estuary, that's harmful, in a different way. So, the best thing we can do is really, address the issues that we're dealing with, which have resulted because we've ditched and drained the entire system from, the Kissimmee chain of lakes all the way down to, Everglades National Park and east and west. And so we need to address that issue through storage. Storage will help with the water volume issue, but it doesn't help with the water quality issue. And that's why it's important that we also have projects that address that water quality, whether it's addressing it at the source, which is way cheaper than trying to treat the water, the nutrients once they get into the water. If you prevent it at the source through agricultural best management practices, through urban best management practices, golf course best management practices, that saves you a lot more than having to remove it once it's in the water column. And then, of course, that storage is critical, because then you can time when you want that water pulse to the Everglades or pulse to the Caloosahatchee, so that we get it when we need it. Because the timing and distribution of those flows is almost just as important as the quality and the quantity of that water.
Yeah, good point. And we've actually got some pretty good questions coming in. Looking at two that are.
Wait, hold on. Before we get into questions, can I want to interrupt this, and so I'm ready to make a drink, but it's time for a fan choice. So we're gonna go. Am I with the dark rum 24 year or the Eagle Rare bourbon? We need a couple of comments here so that we can actually have an official happy hour, because we can't have an official happy hour.
And Chris, every time I say the word Caloosahatchee or Lake Okeechobee, you have to drink.
You're going to have a bad headache tomorrow. Can we apply this retroactively? You're up to 146 drinks right now.
Excellent.
We got one for bourbon.
All right, Colleen from the Fort Myers Chamber of Commerce voting for bourbon here.
Yeah.
I think you just got to go with what she says, because she's got a sweet.
I got a delay on mine.
Oh, sea sucker. Another
bourbon.
vote for the Eagle. There you go.
Yep.
Yeah, Jessica.
All right.
He says both. Mix them.
Yeah. I think there's a nursery rhyme about that. I think we're going with the.
Yeah.
It's
hands. So I
going with
just saw a really good question kind of passed by. It was talking about whether or not the nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, can be recaptured on agricultural lands and be reused.
That was the one from Brian Lynch. That's a really good question.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And Dr. Ed Hanlon from the University of Florida he came up, working with some of his colleagues at the University of Florida, came up with this concept of recyclable water containment areas. And the idea would be that agricultural operations would have land that they would rotate through, where one area would actually be set aside, would be fallow, would be bermed. You would hold water like a stormwater treatment area on that land for a period of time. And that would allow the nutrients to be filtered out of the water into those soils, which of course, you get a lot of leaching of those nutrients into the groundwater and out of those fields, which, based on the concept and the data that he collected, it looked like a really good concept, and certainly something that should be, consider, or at least a pilot project done on a larger scale to see how that performs. Of course, that affects the bottom line of agriculture. They don't want to take any land out of production to do that. But, when we look at the cost benefits of some of these water quality projects, perhaps there's a way that, that we could pay for such a project, like we do with water farming, to hold the water on the landscape, and actually use those nutrients. But we cycle those through so that those nutrients can be used at a different time for the crops that you're trying to grow. So I think it can be done. It's much easier to remove the nutrients before they even get in the watershed, from the start.
Yeah, and that's kind of a
good
transition
point
to that other question from Jessica Pinsky about how much do the existing nutrients sitting at the bottom of the lake contribute to the high nutrient levels downstream. And that's something, I'm not a scientist. I'm not real smart with that kind of stuff, but being out on Lake Okeechobee, there's, if you're bass fishing or duck hunting or whatever you're doing out there, the whole lake is covered in several feet of mud, depending where you're at. And we know that phosphorus binds very well to that muck. So we've got that like trapped muck layer on the bottom that's super phosphorus rich. It's just like really rich black mud, and it didn't used to be that way. Lake Okeechobee used to be a sandy bottom. So when we have those high wind events, storms that come through, how much does all that existing legacy pollution affect us?
So, at different lake levels, it has different effects. When the lake levels are high and that water is sloshing back and forth in Lake Okeechobee like a big bathtub, we tend to see more resuspension. And in 2004, and when those releases occurred in 2005, several hurricanes passed over or near Lake Okeechobee, which stirred up all of those sediments. We had a large volume of water within the lake that was released to the east and west coast estuaries. And as a result, we saw massive macroalgae blooms that covered our beaches for months on end. And so, that has an effect not only on the ecology of Lake Okeechobee, but the downstream estuaries. And I would argue that, it's that sediment that was resuspended that has accumulated over, decades and decades in Lake Okeechobee. It's going to have to be dealt with at some point, because you get what's called internal cycling. You don't have to add any additional nutrients to Lake Okeechobee to get an algae bloom. In fact, you could add spring water to Lake Okeechobee and you're still going to have algae blooms. So, we've got, probably 50 plus years. I think the estimates are somewhere between 50, 75, 100 years of nutrient load in the lake itself, without any additional nutrient sources coming into the lake. So, of course, that's a legacy of water supply back pumping from the agricultural lands into the lake, and the water, the runoff from the watersheds. That is really added to that, the deposits of muck within that system. But it's a really fine silt that tends to get resuspended pretty easily.
good information. And something that add, James, it's a lot easier to stop the nutrients from getting into the water than it is to remove them once they're in there. And I think we've made some great strides, but as far as something that our state legislature, fell short on this year, big time, with BMPs and what we can do to stop, the lion's share of the into Okeechobee in the first place, and that's that's not the direction we need to be moving.
Yeah, and there's actually a really good couple of pieces that the Weather Channel did. I think they're both posted on our Facebook page. They did an investigative report on all that. There's some pretty interesting reads. They're very long, but it's a very comprehensive look at it. So if you haven't already, read through those. If you want to do it tonight, for everybody that's watching that kind of wants some more information, it's kind of a blend of science and politics. But go on there and read those. They're pretty interesting.
Absolutely. And so, Daniel, I noticed one comment about septic tanks, and we haven't really talked a lot about septic. We talked about agriculture, stormwater runoff, but I think it is important to talk a little bit about septic tanks and septic systems and how they function in an area where you have a high groundwater table in particular. One of the major hotspots north of Lake Okeechobee is Taylor Creek. The area north of Lake Okeechobee, it has a high density of homes that are on septic systems, and that sticks out when you start to look at some of those the nutrient areas north of Lake Okeechobee. But it's not just around Lake Okeechobee; it's also in our coastal areas. Here in Lee County, we also have a large number of septic systems. On Sanibel, we've been fortunate to be able to phase just about all of the septic tanks off our island. Because I think that, our forefathers realized early on when they were doing our comprehensive land use plan and collecting data that septic systems really didn't belong on barrier islands with a high groundwater table, an average elevation about 4.5 feet. They just don't work. And so we started working on that in the 90s, and we're at about 90, 95, 98% complete of removing all the septic systems from the island. And of course, it came at a cost. But when you're evaluating the cost of doing those projects, you have to do the cost benefit. What's the cost to your community? What is the impact on your quality of life? What is the impact on your businesses? What is the impact, on your visitors? On your bottom line, if you don't do anything to address your water quality issues, and you just let it go downstream, and somebody else has to deal with it. So, I think it's important to note that, we all play a role here. Septic systems, should be phased out where they're not appropriate, where we have high densities or the groundwater table is high. They work in rural areas where you have large acreage and very low density, but they do not work in areas where you have high density and you have a high groundwater table.
Yeah, that's actually one of the improvements we've made the house we're living in now. When we bought it, I live kind of right on the edge of the 6 Mile Cypress Slough, and we don't have sewer's not an option out here. The county hasn't gone for it. It's mostly 5-acre lots out here. We have a quarter lot, but when we moved in, our septic system every year it would flood, and the water level was really high. And what we ended up doing, we actually went higher than what the county had recommended. We went up another foot just to keep that, higher. That way it's not, it's pouring down rain out right now, and our side yard over there is flooded, but we chose to, go a step higher with it. And we used to get a big kind of swath of super green grass downstream from our septic system. As soon as we switched to that above ground system, we don't see that anymore. The drain fields are not, inundated with water every time it rains. So, but yeah, on an island like Sanibel, when you've got very, sandy substrate there, those nutrients, it doesn't take much for them to get down to the water. And you guys have done an incredible job out there, as being able to convert that to sewer. And the other thing that I want to bring up is, sewer is not a perfect fix unless you have the right infrastructure, which Sanibel does. But we've seen it in downtown Fort Myers. We've seen Bradenton, Tampa Bay area, where you get so much development and outdated sewage infrastructure that anytime it rains, there's crap flying out the storm drains, because the system just can't. And we saw that in Fort Myers after Irma, but it's much more of a regular occurrence up in the Bradenton you know, Tampa Bay area. So it's, as you make those sewer investments, you can't just keep hooking a bunch more toilets to it. You either have to upgrade your infrastructure, or, you know, limit the amount that you can't overload the system, because you end up with, you know, another huge problem. That's, you know, the sewage spills up there. So, you know, I think that, you know, as areas get developed, that's, you know, a conversation that has to happen. You know, how can we make sure that the actual wastewater plants can handle, you know, all these new toilets and drains that are hooked up to them, you know, in times of heavy rain.
Right. And of course, all septic, I mean,
you know,
go ahead, Chris. Chris, go ahead.
You know, it's also, there's, you know, areas, stuff that septic tanks don't work and harmful, as said, where they, but, and as Daniel said, a sewer, just because it's on sewer doesn't mean that it's a perfect deal. And you know, just this week there was a big spill up Sarasota Bay, or in the water to Sarasota Bay from a sewage system. We saw it in Fort Lauderdale area. Tampa Bay happens quite a bit. And you know, the amount of influx of nutrient and everything else that comes along with sewer, when you talk about a mainline sewer break or overflow versus leaching from septic tanks, is also two different scenarios. We have straight raw sewer that's flowing into a water body versus a leaching effect through, you know, through the ground from drain fields that are too wet. It's a bit of impact, and they're bad. You know, neither one of them are good for our water bodies.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's the pathogens and the human health effects associated with those, you know, those discharges that are of a real concern. But I will say, Sanibel's sewer system isn't perfect, and you know, we, through our comprehensive nutrient management plan that we, you know, developed a few years ago, found that our reuse water, the reuse water, the water that we process through our plant and we send to the islands, golf courses, our condominiums, and some of the residential properties here on Sanibel, was one of the primary sources of nutrients to groundwater. And that groundwater was being tidally pumped into our coastal waters, and also contributing to nutrient issues and algae blooms in our stormwater systems, canals, freshwater bodies. So, you know, I think, you know, through, you know, over time and through, you know, science, collecting data and evaluating that data objectively, you know, you can find what the sources are of nutrients in your communities are and target those. You don't want to just, you know, start, you know, throwing darts at the wall and hope something, you know, sticks or works. You want to have a plan. You want to collect that data that tells you what the nutrient sources are and what the best bang for the buck is as you go after those nutrient sources. And we found that, you know, an investment of about $20 million in our water reclamation facility to address the reuse is going to have the biggest benefit of any project that we could do here on Sanibel. So yeah, I think it's important as communities move to convert from septic to sewer, or from sewer plants and upgrade to advanced wastewater treatment, they have to have the data to drive those decisions. And I think every community is different, but letting that science and data drive those decisions rather than just somebody's opinion or what they think, it would be the approach that I would recommend.
Yep. And, you know, something else, James, that we talk about a lot is, you know, we'll have a ton of our supporters reach with, you know, issues around the, and, you know, whether it's Mosquito Lagoon or Indian River or Stewart or St. Pete, you know, Sarasota Bay, and some of the are need to be addressed by the municipality. And you guys, it's on Sanibel, are a great example of that. You know, to fix the septic issues. Daniel's dog. You're a dog. It must be Daniel's dog.
Definitely not.
But to fix the septic issues on Sanibel, that's not something that is big state. That's something the local community has to get together with the municipality to push those solutions. And then, when we're talking about other things like Everglades restoration, Lake Okeechobee, different things like that, those are decisions that have to be made at a state level or even a federal level. So it's important that people understand that there's a lot of issues, where those issues need to be addressed, what entity those issues need to be addressed, and I think you guys are an example of that happening at a local level on San.
Sorry, I disappeared there for a minute, and then Bentley got a little crazy over here. We had food delivery, which is the most important part of the day for me. Got to maintain my figure. So, didn't want to miss out on that one.
Yeah.
So,
what other?
Man, this is a heck of a rainstorm going on right now. It's wild. Some heavy downpours by us.
But, we've been talking about that. We've been getting a ton of rain lately. There's a bunch more rain forecasted in the next 10 days. And, fortunately, we lake that was, managed artificially high right now through the dry season, to where we'd be faced with the possibility of discharges coming to hurricane season. The lake's filling up pretty quickly right now, and you think that it's we don't want to be in a situation where we have to choose losers. We want to be able to manage the lake to be as healthy as it can be, and we want to be able to manage the water bodies to be coastal estuaries and the Everglades healthy. That's why we need Everglades restoration completed. That's why we need the ability to send water south to the Everglades and store water south of Lake Okeechobee to send to the Everglades, is so that we don't rely to pick and lose through management, and we're able to be in a situation where we have more tools in the toolbox to manage water for the priority being the health of the ecosystems that rely or are connected to that water.
Yeah, so you that's a good point. So when Everglades restoration, was adopted or moved forward in the Water Resource Development Act of 2000, it was all of the different project purposes, all of the different, people that were affected by Everglades restoration that came together to make that happen. So it was the people representing the Everglades ecosystem. It was the Miccosukee and Seminole tribes. It was, the agricultural interests, the coastal communities. It was everybody coming together to move that forward, recognizing that it would benefit all users within the system. And it's all about, as we move forward with a lot of these comprehensive Everglades restoration plan projects, it's all about balancing those project purposes so that you don't pick winners and losers, so that we're not sacrificing the coastal estuaries at the expense of water supply, or we're not, sacrificing water supply at the expense of the coastal estuaries and the Everglades. So it's trying to balance those project purposes. And I think if we let science drive the process, it may look different than it does today, because I think politics sometimes gets in the way and tends to drive the process in the way of the people that have the most clout. And I think if we just let the science drive the process, like we are currently with the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, which is the next iteration of the Lake Okeechobee Regulation Schedule, I think if we let the science drive the process, then we'll end up with a schedule that works good for everybody. Everybody's going to have to take a little bit of a hit. we may have, there may be a reduction in water supply, for water supply purposes, or, we, may see a reduction in flows, to the Caloosahatchee, or, we see improvements. But it's all about balancing those project purposes and not putting one at a disadvantage to another.
Yeah, and that balance is something that's what's been missing. We've if you look at the bottom line of how different industries throughout the state have been impacted, we've drawn the short straw more often than not on from the discharges and lack of water down to Florida Bay. So that balance is absolutely critical if we want to leave behind a Florida that's worth living in and worth vacationing to. So that's balance is the key word. It's the word of the day, the word of the month, the word of the year. That's something that we desperately need in this new Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual. And Captains for Clean Water has been loud on it. City of Sanibel has been loud on it. A lot of different organizations have been very loud on that. Everybody that's representing the interests of the public has weighed in on that. So we'll keep working on that. And we certainly want to thank the City of Sanibel for being so awesome on all these issues and providing the science and data that a lot of the decision makers need to understand both about our environment and about our economy and how they're making that connection of how they're linked together. So
thanks, Daniel. I appreciate that. And certainly, our mayor and city council, all of the folks that we've worked with in the, state and, federal legislature that have been supportive of Everglades restoration and our water resource issues, we certainly can't thank them enough. We've had a lot of really good leadership, but we need to continue, moving the ball down the field and hopefully, I know there's a lot of economic impacts associated with the, this recent pandemic. But we also need to understand that there's probably nothing more, that will impact our quality of life, our property values, and our human health, for that matter, than these water issues that we're dealing with in the Caloosahatchee and Lake Okeechobee. So, I think we need to take it in stride, but continue to work together as partners as we are. But pick good leaders. Everybody needs to make sure that they vote and put good people in place that are going to do the right thing and keep moving that ball down the field.
Definitely so. And on that note, I smell a hamburger waiting, a cheeseburger waiting for me over on the counter. And Chris has another live. She's going to be on the Captain. Are you going to be on the Captains or which Instagram feed are you on tonight?
No, I'm going to be. So we're going to be on Cody Richardson. He's an artist. He takes license plates and cuts them into fish designs and makes cool art. We're going to be on his page on Instagram. He's going to do a live. It's Cody Richardson Creations, at Cody Richardson Creations. So we're going to be on there 8 Eastern time. He's basically creating a bunch of cool fish artwork out of license plates that the proceeds from that are going to fund our guide relief, waterway cleanup efforts. We'll elaborate on a little there, but we'll be putting 100 fishing guides on the water around the state of Florida with their families, subsidizing a little bit of their lost income to pay it out there and up the waters and pick up trash and do it with their families. So Cody reached out. Sightlines Provisions, Edgar at Sightlines Provisions originally came to us the idea, and then a bunch kind of stepped up, and Cody's done the same. So I'll be on his page here in about 35 minutes.
Awesome. Well, I'll be eating a delicious cheeseburger from Artisan Eatery and the best sweet potato fries in Southwest Florida, which they also produce. So, and if y'all are not doing it already, support all of our local restaurants, the small ones. If you're ordering takeout, don't forget about the mom and pops, because they're really struggling right now. And we've got some good restaurants in Fort Myers, but there's not a ton of them. And if you're not giving them your money and eating their food right now, they might not be there. This has hit them really hard. So, you know, it's easy to do the whole chain restaurant thing, but don't forget about our local mom and pop businesses, especially right now. And it's pretty
I
easy
think
to get
that
through. I mean,
goes for all small businesses.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely so.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I mean, you eat 3 times
Yeah,
a day.
it's-
You can pick a mom and pop, you know, cook a couple meals at the house and eat something from a mom and pop restaurant. That's easy to do. You don't have to suffer through that one. So pick your favorite restaurant and
That's
get some
right.
food.
James, thanks a lot for
Thank you so
joining
much,
us.
James.
Well, thank you guys for the opportunity to talk. I think it was really a fun discussion, and look forward to working with you guys.
Yeah, and if there's ever anything else important you want to get out, our platform is yours whenever you want to join us. So thanks again, and we'll look forward to working with you more on all these issues.
Excellent. Thanks, guys.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks everybody for tuning in.